AI is not going to take your job. Humans who know how to use AI are going to take your job, and companies that know how to leverage AI are going to take your. Like, this is coming, and technology is undefeated. We're insistent in industry and being John Henry, trying to hammer in rail lines by hand, ignoring the fact that there's a steam hammer coming behind us.
Just individuals, professionals in our industry, when I bring up something as basic today as ChatGPT, are looking at me like incredulous, and they're like, what are you talking about, ChatGPT?
Spoiler for everyone, that owner's goals are going to be NOI. Whether it's NOI today or NOI in 5 years, but it will always be tied to NOI because that's where value is created in this business. And if you're not having those conversations, and you're being successful, you can't attribute it to anything but luck. Because if you don't know the game you're playing, and you don't know the target you're aiming for, you hit it, it was not on purpose. That's just an impossibility. Just teach people how to do things, right? Like, a lot of times when a maintenance technician gets hired, they're just kind of thrown into the deep end. You give people career paths where they can thrive. You know, how many of the best leasing agents who've ever worked in this industry now work on the.
Hello, everyone. We are back live again. This is the Multifamily Hangout. I'm your host, Adrian Danila. Super excited about the conversation we're about to have today. Chris Moreno, take it away, sir.
Absolutely. And yeah, super excited. You know, we're all remote today, but I'm excited to have prolific Stephen Rea, who has bold and very forward-thinking viewpoints on the industry. You know, he's got a lot of experience as a multifamily operator, but also as a technologist, you know, having worked at a company that had three prongs to it, previously with ResProp, ATX. Obviously, they did all types of different things. So we'll dive into some of the work you've done in the past, some things you're thinking about now, and what you see into the future. But I think the biggest thing, too, is you're not afraid to put it the way it is, Stephen, whether it's challenging the status quo, calling people out where you think you have a unique perspective, and then backing it up with data, especially even like thinking about QVC style leasing tours. Want to hear about that. But you also think about a results-driven perspective, especially when it comes to better teams, smarter systems, and then driving real NOI. So thanks again, Stephen, for joining us today. Welcome to the pod.
Yeah, I appreciate it, guys. I'm excited to do it. I've known you both for quite a while now, and you're right. I'm not very shy with my opinions, at least not anymore. That's the benefit of not being 25 anymore. Is, you know, now in my 40s, I'm a lot more comfortable just pointing stuff out. And unfortunately, as you alluded to, have had some really cool opportunities in the past that have kind of shaped and worked for some incredible people that really shaped a lot of that perspective. And yeah, excited to chat.
Yeah, and I'd love to ask you first, you know, one of the first questions I want to ask you is, how the heck did you get into multifamily? Was it from a technology perspective, or did you fall into it, or did you plan to get into it?
Like most people, I would say in the industry, especially operators, I fell into it. I worked sales jobs basically my entire life. And while working one sales job, was like, you know, I should probably buy real estate. Everyone says that's good. And I was thinking mostly like duplexes and fourplexes. And I retired from sales in my early 20s because I just really didn't like straight commission sales, and worked for a private investor for about 3 years. At our peak, we had about 125 properties, and it was a blended portfolio. So we had 16-unit apartment community that paid by the week. We had industrial, we had retail, we had commercial office, we had a little bit of everything. So got exposed to a lot there. That was very mom and pop, and then left and ended up joining RPM Living before it was RPM Living, back when it was called Roscoe Properties. At the time I joined, we had 400 units total and about 12 employees, which was in 2008. I was really lucky to get to work with directly with Jason Berkowitz and my mentor Angelique Goodenough, and just learned a ton. So yeah, I kind of fell into multi. Real estate had my interest, but I very quickly fell in love with multifamily, especially through the process of getting my CPM, which Jason was really kind to support early in my career when I still worked on site. And through that process, I think I love the puzzle that this industry is, and learning that every investor has different goals, objectives. You know, every property could be run a million different ways, and trying to figure out that mix between what are the owner's goals, what are they trying to accomplish with this investment, and then how do I make that reality? was just fun and exciting for me, and quickly found me in a place in the early Roscoe days of writing process. And because I knew how to plug in a computer, I was put in charge of the tech stack and got to go to Yaz conferences, the Yardi conferences all the time. Got a really grounded understanding of the value of process. We were doubling in size at Roscoe in those days every year. So, I feel like in my 8 years there, I feel like I worked for three very distinct companies. And then seeing that growth and the challenges that come with that growth, and doing so from a leadership role in the organization was tremendous for me. I've always been a bit of a you asked about, the technology side. I've always been an early adopter. I like to think of myself as kind of the bottom of the hockey stick when new stuff comes out. The best example I have is, I should probably find it at some point, but I have a very expensive paperweight that's a Humane pen somewhere in my office. Like, I like playing with the new stuff. I have the Apple, I'm not sure what it's called. Their VR, the spatial computing stuff. Never use most of those things practically, but I've always had an interest. Being exposed to the Yardi side was really valuable when I was at Roscoe, and then, as you also mentioned, working with ResProp, I got to see behind the scenes on how tech is built on the advisor side for technology companies, and got kind of frustrated at the end of 2023 that most people who were building things didn't understand what needed to be built, and most people who understood what needed to be built didn't know how to describe what they want to build or wanted to be built. And that felt like a really cool opportunity for me to, I don't know, take a swing, right? AI's opened up a lot of opportunities, and I can always go back to property management if I need to. I think there's a huge need on the training of employees as well as the technology side to just make this industry simple again. There's always complexity when you're providing people homes, but we've also made the industry very complicated over the last 15 years. And I think that's the root cause of a lot of our issues. So why not try to fix it? I got tired of complaining about it. If no one's doing it, why not me?
Lots to unpack out there, Steven. But I want to go back to your experience with RPM, and then the way they grew exponentially over the years, and you've been part of that growth. What were the best lessons that you learned from scaling the business, being like a important part of scaling this particular business for like hundreds of units to like tens of thousands?
That's a good question. And it's something that a lot of companies struggle with. There's a little bit, because of the nature of what we do. You know, property management is a lot of ways kind of like a restaurant. It's not a huge margin business. Definitely not like software where you're running 70% gross margins. It's more like single digits, maybe low double digits if you're doing it really well. So a lot of companies do chase scale. I had a really interesting juxtaposition between my time at ResProp and my time at RPM. We were incredibly intentional at RPM about what markets we went to when, especially when we were small. And I think that's a mistake a lot of people make. We had well over 1,000 units in Austin before we went to San Antonio. We had well over 1,000 units in San Antonio before we went to Houston. We had well over 1,000 units in Houston before we went to Dallas. And we always put a local regional manager in market. We were very intentional on that side of things. We were also incredibly selective with the people that we worked for. I can remember early on when we probably had 1,000 units, we had the opportunity to take over a 700 unit portfolio, which would have been huge for us because of some issues with the ownership and them not wanting to fund the things they said they were going to fund. I think we turned in keys in about 10 days, and said, sorry, this isn't a fit for us. So that lesson also is one that really stayed with me, is you might make a mistake, but recognizing that mistake quickly and unwinding yourself from that mistake. And the other thing that we did that I think was really valuable early, that's harder to retain as you grow, is we were very much a Yardi shop. I ran training there for 3.5 years, and as well as the software stack and all the support. And like, we had one dashboard. We didn't want extra logins. We didn't want people bouncing between things. Like, there was a very clear recognition that what people do, especially on site, is very hard. As I would refer to it now, it's a very distraction rich environment. And anything you introduce on top of that that's going to take away from what's being done or where the focus needs to be ultimately doesn't usually work out very well. So we were very intentional about what we rolled out, when we rolled it out. When I left, we had about 16,000 units with a very clear roadmap to probably 20, 25 over the next few months. That was at the end of 2016, which is kind of crazy to think about, that they've got well over 200,000 units less than 10 years later. Had just, had less than 20,000 at the time. I would say the other really big thing that Jason was brilliant about is I was put in charge of training when we had less than 1,000 units. I had a second person on my team when we had less than 3,000 units. I had a third person on my team when we had less than 6,000 units. There's not a lot of 6,000 unit companies with 3 people dedicated to training and support. But that focus and intention on building great people is what created, like, if you look at that company today, a lot of their leadership came from those days. There's a lot of people who I worked with or who worked for me or around me while I was there who were in really key roles now. And what's allowed them to scale so quickly is that they had that density of talent, and they developed it themselves. Now, obviously, when Alliance got bought by Graystar, and Jason was very smart in going and getting a lot of those Alliance people who needed a home. But prior to that, it was a lot of just developing great people, having them rise up, because that's where your culture comes from. And Jason was incredible about that. Like that's probably that the focus on training and the intent being very intentional about when we grow and how we grow were probably the big things. So that we didn't. I mean, the whole time I was there, we didn't lose a property in 8 years. We never took a step backwards. We never lost. Like we just, and that was because of that. Like slow and steady. Let's be very intentional and let's just do this right.
Something else I think that stands out is challenging beliefs that many people will sometimes have. You have people who are saying they're innovative or maybe not actually innovative or taking the chances or bold moves. But what's maybe one of the most dangerous beliefs holding multifamily back right now?
That technology is a solution and not a tool. That's probably the biggest one. That's one that I rant about a fair bit. I blame software companies somewhat for that, but I also blame leadership and organizations who are looking for a quick fix. Software is sold as a solution. No software is a solution. Software is only a tool. If you give me a block of marble and a chisel and a hammer, I'm going to give you about a million small blocks of marble back. If you give that block of marble to Michelangelo, you get things like David, right? Like the skill of the person using the tool matters. And the industry's moved to mostly remote training. They've pawned off a lot of their training to software companies who don't really understand the business. Most training, and from the people I've talked to in the industry, to just kind of validate and explore this idea, most companies are spending 60, 70% of their time teaching people how to use software and not how to run properties. And I think that misunderstanding, and I can empathize with why. Like I mentioned earlier, it's the desire and need to scale, to find revenue and find profitability. Like it's really hard to operate a 10,000 unit management company or 8,000 unit or 5,000 unit management company in a profitable way and make the investments where you'd like to be making them. Can't hire the property controller you want. You can't hire the marketing team you want, right? Like so everyone's looking to farm these things out. In farming them out, you also lose control of a lot of it. That ultimately, I think, is what got us to where we are over the last 12 to 15 years. I'd point at revenue management as a really great example of that. Go to any property and ask them, like, what's going on with your comps? What are your rents? And they'll say basically like whatever the algorithm tells me is what the rents are. So that's you know a microcosm of what most of these issues are. We're about to do that same thing with leasing, which just seems silly to me. Like I don't know why you would entrust the most important aspect of your business, which is maintaining revenue, to an AI assistant that's honestly just not quite there yet.
Is there a way to roll this back? Is there a way to look at the current stack and say, we can operate like the Apple store here? We can expect our leasing agents to be proficient in like 60 different pieces of software. The most entry level person in a business, right? A leasing agent. Are there actual solutions to roll this back, to rein it in, to find those common sense solutions to actually make things work to where like people actually do the work other than just trying to learn new software and trying to help prospects and residents navigate through existing software, because that's what they do most of the time.
Quick answer is yes. However, I don't think that comes from the NMHC top 50. It might come from some of the REITs who have a little bit more control through their full stack and who are incentivized like throughout the entire P&L statement of themselves as an organization to do so. But what I've seen happen as with companies as they get larger, and it's as much as I love my time at RPM Living and have a ton of respect for the people there, and I went through this at ResProp as we grew too. Um, Silos start to form, and then you start to have people running teams and running departments who all have their own budgets, who all have their own things that they're responsible for, and I think that makes it really, really challenging for large companies to make the shifts that need to be made, especially if you're third party. Now, could they do it? Maybe, but I don't see Greystar retraining, you know, 20,000 leasing agents, across the organization to into a new job role that's more appropriate for an entry level position, or RPM Living or any of those companies being able to do that because the cost of change is so big and the challenge of change is so big at that size of a company. I do think the industry is ripe for disruption, for innovative operators who are thinking outside the box. Adrian, I think I've mentioned to you before. I think I think the peak or like the ideal size for a company is somewhere probably between 15 and 30,000 units because you don't get all the layers of bureaucracy that develop over time. It takes a smaller company to build something different and to be able to imagine something different. And I'll give you an example of someone who's doing great and some people I've gotten to know over the past probably year and a half. Charles Gate, Michael DeMella, I think both of you know the team over there. They're taking a first principles approach to operations and management and building something that looks very different. And ultimately, I think that's going to be incredibly impactful for them and a group that I'm rooting for. We tried to do the similar thing at ResProp with a small team that I ran, where we tried to kind of reimagine from first principles and learned a lot, made some mistakes, but I do think it's possible. I just think for the biggest companies, it's would be really challenging and kind of the history of business. Have either of y'all read The Innovator's Dilemma or familiar with it?
I
Um,
heard about it, but I
yeah.
couldn't, I couldn't say exactly
So
what it is.
yeah, in that book, they talk a lot about how industries get disrupted, and it's never the incumbent, right? It's people from the outside who see the gaps, who understand the issues, in a very nuanced way. But because they're small, they're nimble enough to be able to try things, experiment, adapt, evolve, and that's ultimately why industries get disrupted. It's not from the incumbent saying like, we're doing really well, let's just change everything tomorrow, because it might work. The risks and things to mitigate are too great for larger organizations.
You just killed my follow-up question because I was about to ask you, do you think that disruption is going to come from within or from the outside? But I do have a question regarding this. Let's look at the models like Amazon, Uber, and McDonald's. Imagine those companies having a play in multifamily real estate. Could that be like a real disruption out there? I mean, for example, let's just take McDonald's, and they found a way to operate a multi-billion, maybe $1 trillion business with employees that pay pretty, minimum wage, and it's a very successful business to my knowledge, right? And we're pretty much alike, like property management. Our pay is not really competitive with trades or with other areas of real estate. I will say we're behind. It's hard to compete. Would that be a real situation? And how would you see that happening? And then also Amazon goes on a procurement side. Like we're doing procurement like it's 1990, relationship based, and so is nowhere near 2025. Technology is not there. Everything is relation based, and if you're gonna buy over $1 million, I kick another extra percentage point of Amazon is not gonna play that. They have the infrastructure, they have everything. Also, I know for a fact that they're actually silently entering multifamily. They actually have reps assigned to multifamily, and they're entering in some states. I heard about Washington State. So, what's your take on this type of companies disrupting and those business models actually applying whatever could work in multifamily property management?
Well, I think there's people who've tried it already. As I recall, Lifetime Fitness did some apartments in the Dallas area, a few years ago that were Lifetime branded. I definitely think there's an opportunity there. big picture, Marriott also is getting into some of the more long-term rental markets now as well, especially at the top of the market. They've always had that to an extent, but now they're building where it was like, staying in a penthouse or staying in a suite at a hotel. But they're now actually looking into purpose building or starting to build things that are much more blended to a long-term solution. So I think it's definitely coming. For me, what a lot of those companies recognize that I kind of keyed in on in 2017, 2018, which is there's no brands in multifamily. There's names, but there's no brands. And there's no one who's really willing to put their brand on the line in like real consumer facing marketing and advertising. And there's a lot of brands that could do it. The hospitality industry is something I look at for this a lot in terms of how they adapted to when their product was commoditized by the internet, right? So when they got commoditized by the internet, they could either compete on price or they could compete on brand. And they chose to compete on brand and they went heavy brand, heavy rewards programs. And multifamily, when we got commoditized by the internet via ILSs, decided that it would just compete on price. And that ultimately isn't why people rent apartments, right? Like price is a factor, but leasing is an emotional decision. Deciding where you want to live, right? It's not someone's castle. I think there's an opportunity. I think it wouldn't be, it might be like a Lifetime or a Marriott or someone like that, but I think it's probably going to be more a collaboration between really experienced operators who kind of know the industry, but aren't constrained by what was done, to partner with some of these technology companies or other really good operators and executors, again, to build something new and different, and take more of a 20-year lens on like what are we trying to build and why are we trying to build it. But I always think there's a lot we can learn from other industries. You mentioned procurement. Procurement's a massive issue. I think you and I have gone back and forth previously, Adrian, on some LinkedIn comments about the fact that budgets are kind of silly in this business, right? Like no one actually pays attention to them. They're just numbers on a spreadsheet in most people's minds. I can't remember the last property that was like, sorry, we can't, it's the 12th of the month, we can't buy anything, or we need to really like look at what we're spending so we don't go over budget. This industry likes to look backwards. So I think as you get more experienced, like different sorts of operators coming in, there's definitely an opportunity there. But I'm reminded, I've looked everywhere for this actual clip, but I saw it once and it stuck with me. It was an interview with Steve Jobs where they talked about new technology. He said, what happens with any new technology is that most of the time, the first adopters are trying to adapt the new technology to the old patterns of doing things instead of allowing, and then, but then the people who are successful are the ones who allow that new technology to define a new way of doing things. There's a lot of things you can point to in this industry. Procurement's one. I think our job roles are a really obvious one, right? Like when I started in the industry, I was still taking bank bags to the bank, but we at least had electronic accounting software. But the job roles that we use today, entry level leasing, assistant manager, manager, were put in place in like the late 80s and 90s, right? And that's when we were doing paper ledgers and taking bank bags to the bank. And your property manager had to also be the accountant, be the one who's doing all of that work. But today that doesn't apply anymore. But we've still retained this old mindset of how we do things. Whereas if you were to start again from first principles and just, I actually did this a couple of years ago. I first on post-it notes and then a Trello board mapped out all the actions that need to be taken by a property to be successful, independent of job role. And then I looked at those and tried to reassemble them into things that seemed to make sense based on the level of experience that people had. And sales would not have been my entry level role. I would make that an aspirational role. I would pay those people significantly more than what they make today. And that was really eye opening for me. And I think there are people thinking about that. There's people who, the name of the company is escaping me, but they're from the Pacific Northwest area. Jim Rostel is one of the co-founders. He and his wife, they started centralized, right? The way they operate their properties is very different than your typical operator. I think that's kind of where that gap is. But going back to the disruption piece, I absolutely think it's coming. I think people are trying. The WeWork founder has Flow, right? I believe, which is mostly in Florida, where he's trying to do some interesting things. For anyone who's thinking about trying to be disruptive. I'll just share my what would be my major point of emphasis early, because everyone tends to go to the top of the market and think about services, but that's hard to scale down. If you look, and again, if you use hospitality as your reference point, like the hotel brands usually have a lot of brands under one umbrella. What's consistent there? It's your experience when you go there. Well, in our industry, what's the experience most often tied to? It's maintenance. So if you could solve for maintenance, that's something you could build a brand around. And that's something that honestly no company has figured out how to do at scale, at all. And Adrian, you and I have talked about that before. You know that, right? Like maintenance is a struggle, both from a staffing standpoint. We have this 1 to 100 thing. I'm a big believer that centralized maintenance in some fashion is the solution, or at least dynamically dispatched maintenance on a daily basis. Avalon Bay is doing some really interesting things in that space with their Canso Twin Book property in the DC area. So there are people trying, but I think that is going to be where the first differentiators really stand out. And then the other side is going to be, how do you improve your back office operations? All this technology we see right now is all like customer facing. It's all resident and prospect facing. Where's the points, where's the solutions that let an accountant successfully be a property accountant for 20 properties without any additional strain as opposed to 8 or 10, right? How do you make your marketing team half the size but twice as good? That's all the overhead that management companies carry. So if we're worried about 9 to 11% operating margins, well, we don't fix that. You can fix that with scale, but you can also just fix that by figuring out ways to improve your efficiencies and cut costs. Accounting is another thing that a lot of management companies, especially smaller ones, struggle with.
And now a word from Dean Fungawing, founder and CEO, Kairos.
We take that personal touch of showing up to the property, meeting with the building engineers, meeting with the site maintenance teams, and saying, you tell us where you see the most problems. We're not going to assume that we know where your particular problems are, right? And when they start telling us like, dishwashers aren't a problem, but water heaters are a big problem, right? Well, last year we had a fire suppression system that froze and it leaked down into 8 apartments, caused $300,000 worth of damage, right? Those conversations are invaluable because now I've got a historical marker where I have a quantitative problem. I have now not just said, oh, water is a problem, or fire is a problem, or freeze is a problem. I've now told you how much that problem cost me last year. And I say, okay, if this year I can prevent a pipe freeze, if this year I can prevent another water heater from destroying and getting out of control, I can't stop the water heater from leaking, but I can tell you about it early enough, because the name of the game with water is get to it as fast as possible.
Interesting. You hit on a lot of points there. Number one, I think of, like you're talking about centralization, you're seeing some people do it, even removing staff from the sites, whether it was Avalon Bay with one of their brands, rolling out. And I think Avalon created maybe 4 or 5 brands now, and specifically has done that. Steve Merchant, I talked to him over at Newcastle, out of Chicago. He's doing everything he can to move everything off site, third parties, et cetera. And to your point, like people say, well, we'll never remove people from property. I think it depends. It depends if, you want to have a different experience. Airbnb has done it. Many brands have done it. But you're right. To your point, it's never the people, generally never the incumbents who are the disruptors, whether it's Airbnb, Uber, Apple, right? He didn't build computers. He said we could build a new one. We could build a better one, and we could do it completely differently. But yeah, to your point about Adam Newman, whether it's Switchyards, WeWork, Industrious. We just had Brad Hargraves last week give a discussion at RETC and NMHC about autonomous vehicles. And it's funny because he's like, we had the promise 7 years ago. And so everyone kind of, when that promise came, it was overpromised, underdeliver. So people said it's not going to happen. He's like, actually, now it's going to happen. And here's why. And it was really interesting because like people kind of go through these points, maybe they're too early for demand. I kind of get curious to get your take. Should we have, is it that we have too many generalists that are already overwhelmed and they're already in the space and we need more spiky people? Or do you think we have too many spiky people who are good at one thing and we should have more generalists? Like, I'm kind of curious to know your thoughts around, do you prefer to become a generalist, or do you try to find the best people at one role around you to help disrupt?
There's a handful of things there. First, on the staffing, especially with on-site site teams, I don't necessarily think you'd go with less people. I think their roles are different and their pay structures. Not to just kind of be a broken record on the hospitality thing, but I do think future leasing offices look a lot more like a hotel lobby than they do like the modern leasing office. To where you have front desk people and a concierge or like resident support person, is what you call that role. But manage like a lot of, and you still have managers and regionals there daily, in some capacity, but that it's not necessarily to 100 ratio that it's been historically. And the interesting thing about changing job role structures is you can actually usually get more people for the same or less wages when you're not being constrained by having to like I use lead maintenance roles as an example a lot. And Adrian can probably attest to this. Your lead maintenance guy is doing work that's not lead maintenance level at least half the time, right? And so that's all just lost payroll that could be going somewhere else. And I think that same thing applies to a lot of roles within the industry overall. Now, as far as specialist versus generalist, I think the answer is both. And it just depends on where you are in the company and what you're being asked to do. I'm benefiting right now from being a very capable generalist, right? And you need people who have that broader perspective within an organization. Now, that being said, I think our reliance on finding journalists has been something that's hurt the industry over the last decade because if you think about the career path for someone who starts on site, it really makes no sense when you break it down, right? The entry level role is sales. That's one personality type who's really good at that. Then we move them into a bookkeeping and accounting position, right? Chasing AR, the role of a system manager. And then we move them into what should be a strategic and leadership position as the property manager. Again, slightly different archetype than the two that preceded that. When I think about how I would build something today, I'd probably have a sales and marketing stack of people. I'd have a customer support and back office stack of people, and I'd have a maintenance stack of people. And those would be specialists. You give people career paths where they could thrive. How many of the best leasing agents who've ever worked in this industry now work on the vendor side doing sales because they can make more money, right? They get recruited all the time off properties. Hey, you're really good at this. I love your personality. Do you want to come sell flooring and triple your salary? Right? Like that's super common in the industry. And why do those people leave? Because they don't want to be an assistant manager because they don't see a career path on like how to get how to have a career in the industry that's going to pay them what they want to make. I think the answer is both. Depends on the size of the organization. When you're a small organization, you probably need more generalists because you got to wear a bunch of hats. When you're a large organization, you need more specialists because journalists get distracted easily. Speaking at least from my experience as a generalist, the answer is both. And in reality, there's no. One of the things I think humans tend to look for is silver bullets, right? Like what's the pill? What's the thing I can do? Someone just give me the playbook and let me implement the playbook. And if I can implement that playbook, then I'll be fine, right? And there's a lot of companies that have tried to do that. A lot of people who started management companies the last 15 years who thought it was easy, who tried to do that. And that's just not reality. Like that's not how things tend to work. The best companies are the people who figure it out and get in the weeds and and have a somewhat unique perspective, or at least have a perspective on how they think things should be done. And I think that's more important than ever with AI. I've said a handful of times recently, AI is not going to take your job. Humans who know how to use AI are going to take your job, and companies that know how to leverage AI are going to take your job. How every management company in the country doesn't have some LLM team license where they're asking their team to get familiar with this because it's a muscle. It's something you have to do. You have to use it to understand how to use it. And the difference with AI than social and mobile and the internet and the computer revolutions that have dotted the last 30 years is the benefit of using modern tools compounds and accelerates. It's not a linear path. It's a geometric or maybe even algorithmic path in terms of progress. So if you aren't starting to think about what your company looks like in 5 years, you might not have a company. Because if you think you're just going to be doing what you're doing now, and you're not, someone with over 100,000 units who's got some like ability or like a REIT or an owner operator, you're going to be in real trouble. a lot of what I try to do with my content and other things is just try to ring these bells and generate awareness that like this is coming and technology is undefeated. We're insistent on being as an industry and being John Henry trying to, you know, hammer in rail lines by hand, ignoring the fact that there's a steam hammer coming behind us and that's just going to transform everything about how this job is done.
I want to double down on that and say that I'm seeing this as well, to where like just individuals, professionals in our industry, when I bring up something as basic today as ChatGPT, are looking at me like incredulous, and they're like, "What are you talking about, ChatGPT?" Conversations being along the lines of like, "How do you basically compare two bids?" Okay, like something as simple as that, or three bids, and they're like, "Well, I'm using Excel, so I pull all the numbers and I plug them into an Excel." So I can't help myself but to ask, "Did you know that actually ChatGPT could do that for you in seconds?" And it saves you probably like hours or days worth of work or your assistant. And I'll tell you that, more often than not, I get a stare, look. And, it's pretty common conversation, I should say. You're right. Technology doesn't wait. It's not forgivable. It's not forgiving. It's not forgetting. And it's moving fast, like faster than ever before. So question to you now is, Stephen, if you were to burn it all down and rebuild it back up, what would property management look like for you in your vision?
That's really hard to answer concisely. Because
I know it's a big
but
question.
just
I know it's a big question.
well,
We,
one
we
I
could talk
would
about it for an entire day, but at least I wanted to hear, like, basics. What are some basics? You kind of cover on people, right? When Chris asked the generalist versus, like, the specialist question, but then there's more to it than that too, right? People is just like one pillar, but what other pillars, you see, like base pillars, and then how would you apply your science, your knowledge, your wisdom to changing everything, like rebuilding everything from the scratch?
all the job roles would be different. This is, we'll say, a hypothetical. If I could, clap my hands and make it happen. So all the job roles would be different. Technology would be um, all under a single umbrella. So you'd have a single solution for everything, one login, dynamic dashboards that change based on job role and the task that's being done, software that teaches you how to use it itself and has ability to have like a tutorial or training mode. Like video games are really good about this, where they drop you into a new world and environment, and then they teach you the world. And then once you know the world, they let you into the broader game. That could happen with software today if people wanted to build it. I think the performance improve, like there's this chase to have like the best of everything. And it's where all these, and we've had all these point solutions spin up. And there's tons of surveys of people and teams that are navigating between 20, 30, 40 plus different softwares to run a property every day. There's a cost to all of that. Chris mentioned Apple a few times. I'm partial to that Apple approach and mindset. I don't think we need a CRM that's like Salesforce or right that has every bell and whistle, because we don't have cold prospects. Anyone who contacts our property has already seen our pricing, seen photos, and mentally envisioned themselves living there. So we don't need drip campaigns. We don't need cold outreach. We don't need a lot of this stuff. We just need capable salespeople, which we don't have in most cases. Which would, I guess, lead me to the other thing is a refocus on teaching people what their job is, why it matters, a real emphasis on the fact that we provide people their homes. When you talk to people in the industry, some people say that, but very few actually like internalize that and feel it. Right? What does it mean to provide someone their home? They're 25+% of the apartments in this industry are run poorly, just like by the law of averages. So people's ACs are out all the time, or they're not getting things fixed, or they have managers who don't care. And that quite literally can ruin someone's life, right? Like shelter and safety is the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs for a reason. And when that isn't good, your job sucks, your relationships suck, right? Like you're not happy, you're stressed all the time, and no one seems to be willing to like talk about that in a really meaningful way and acknowledge the fact that not only do we need to be better, but we have an obligation to be better. We provide people with their homes. That is no small thing. It is one of the most rewarding things we can do, but it's also one of the most important things that are done, period, in society. And we've taken that for granted. And everyone's, especially as companies get big, everyone just turns it into a number on a spreadsheet. And when you're looking at things through averages, and you have 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 units, and your average occupancy might be 95%, or your average maintenance resolution time might be 3 days. But then when you get into the actual numbers, you have 3,000, 2,000 units where people are not having that same experience. And owners are losing money, their investors are losing money, who are often, people just trying to build a better lives for themselves. Like the hundreds of millions of lives that our industry touches via 1 or 2 degrees of separation is profound. And I think having lost that recognition, and it's part of why I started my company is, I got kind of a front row seat to that from 2020 to 2023. Because ResProp, we were a good management company, but we took over a lot of really, roughly managed things. And there were some properties that we didn't do as good of a job on. And you see that and you start seeing the downstream effects of it, or like struggling to pay vendors on time, right? Well, those vendors are small businesses most of the time, right? And they got to make payroll, and they're trying to grow their business and support their families. And we just kind of go blind to all of that. So, I think job roles, um, better implementation of technology, a first principles approach to everything that we do, and then really being passionate about why we're doing it because of the lives it touches. And making sure that the people who work in the industry understand and know that. So I think, for me, those are the core things, because with technology is going to change. Like we're seeing, you mentioned how fast it's moving. It's hard to believe it's been less than 3 years since ChatGPT came out. Right, that was November of 22, and it's been less than 2 years since it was good, right, and actually useful, and less than 6 months since the reasoning models came out. And now we have Llama 4, and we have DeepSeek, and we have all and Grok 3, and all this stuff that's it is moving incredibly fast. So I think it's, for me, the challenges are more about the people, both from what they do and what they're taught to do, and then caring, really. And if you can do those two things, everything else can kind of fall into place just by being intentional and thinking about it and understanding, like, what do we need to do here to make this stuff like better and work, because again, we have to.
I love what you're saying, and I think, yeah, too many people. Oftentimes, I think about it as the idea that when you're at one company, you're a baseball team, let's say, versus when you're Bud Selig and you can see the entire baseball, what everyone's doing, and then there's the commissioner of the NCAA, which is all the sports and all the teams across all the entire country. And I think what you're diving into is pretty interesting, because some people say these are our golden metrics. This is what works so well. They're blinded for the forest by the trees. And I'm kind of curious to get your take. Like, I think about like Richard Branson, who famously said, like, you take care of your employees and allow them to take care of the customer. Generally, the rest of it will take care of itself. They're focused on the mission, focused on the vision, and then just really that customer solving their problems all the time. I'm curious to get your take. Like, you talked about almost like this tyranny of metrics. So what are some of, like, maybe the most disastrous KPIs? And then what are some of the KPIs that maybe you don't think people are focusing on enough? Is it customer scores, feedback, or are there some other metrics that maybe people are ignoring?
So I love that you mentioned the tyranny of metrics. That's one of my favorite books, and it's built around Goodhart's law, which is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Which basically is, when you start focusing on anything to optimize for it, you will optimize for it, but sometimes to the detriment of your actual goals. And I think our industry has conflated measures and targets. So we make things like occupancy a measure, and occupancy doesn't matter. Investors don't care about occupancy. They actually care about NOI. Now, that's not to say occupancy doesn't matter, but occupancy matters in service to the actual goal, which is NOI. And that's what, like, really good regional managers are exceptional at being translators, taking financial goals from ownership and turning those into operational goals for their team. Now, on the KPI front, and this is also maybe a little bit more broadly, one of the challenges the industry has had, especially as it's scaled and partly due to limitations of previous technology, is most properties are operated via a cookie cutter business plan. So if you have a lease up, every lease up's run basically the same. We need ILSs, we're going to do discounts, we're going to do, this and that. And there's a handful of people thinking differently about that. And like the team at Authentic is one that immediately comes to mind, who's thinking, Chris Arnold is thinking differently about that sort of thing. So I'm working on a course with Stacey Hampton, who's amazing for anyone who doesn't know her. And one of the things we're going to focus on early is KPIs, because they could be different at the same property depending on who the owner is and what their owner's objectives are. Right? Like someone who's going to sell a property in 2 years is very different than someone who's going to own it for the next 7. Right? So what you're optimizing for, right? So there is no cookie cutter. This is the way that we should. These are the KPIs that we need to pay attention to, because they should be adapted to the specific property, its challenges, and the goals of that ownership group that they're trying to accomplish. Like a lease up's KPIs or a Class A 2023 built property should be different than a company or than a property that's looking to do deep value added renovations. Or, I mentioned earlier, like an owner is looking to sell into, or if you have two side by side properties, phase one and phase two, they were built 2 years apart. Depending on you think they're identical, we're gonna have the same goals. Not necessarily. That all depends on what ownership is looking to accomplish. And I think that's one of our big misses as an industry is we don't ask that question enough. Right? Like how often, and anyone who's watching or listening, like if you're a regional manager, when was the last time you asked your client, who's your customer, not your residents, your property owners are your customer, what are their goals? What are they trying to accomplish? And then revisiting that conversation regularly and saying, what has anything changed? Are these still the goals? By the way, here's some things I can do to help you accomplish your goal better. Or here's some challenges that we have. Owners have gotten very in the weeds of management because management hasn't been very good. Management's been very easy until about 2 years ago, relative to where it is now. But now that it's getting hard, owners don't want to talk to you about how to run the property. They hire us as operators to drive the bus. And there's not enough people in the industry today who know how to drive the bus. And candidly, that's not necessarily their fault. We had 12 years of the best market ever, and you didn't have to be great. And we've gone through probably 3 generations of people in the industry in that 12 years, right? The people who are regional managers today, or a lot of VPs, have never operated in a down market. They joined after 2011. And that's not those people's fault, but that is the leaders of those organizations' fault for not recognizing that like the industry is different. So for KPIs, for me, it always starts with owners' goals. And then what KPIs for this asset are going to get me closer to those owners' goals. Spoiler for everyone, that owner's goals are going to be NOI, whether it's NOI today or NOI in 5 years, but it will always be tied to NOI because that's where value is created in this business. And if you're not having those conversations and you're being successful, you can't attribute it to anything but luck. Because if you don't know the game you're playing and you don't know the target you're aiming for, if you hit it, it was not on purpose. Like that's just an impossibility. And we have a lot of people in the industry today who that is the reality. And that's why we're struggling. Why our turnover is so high. People want help and they can't get help because there's no one that knows how to help them.
Steven, we're marking a premiere right now. Someone from overseas is watching. Actually, it's Sajid from Islamabad in Pakistan.
I know
Question.
Sajid.
Yeah, and he has a question for you. How can AI train the technicians of the future? And then how do you think AI can empower the generalists and help businesses rely lesser on experts?
So 2 really good questions. I'll plug Sajid's company a little bit. OnSense is a great way to help your technicians to be able to function more capably. But also, and Adrian, when you and I last saw each other in person, we talked about this a lot. Just teach people how to do things, right? Like a lot of times when a maintenance technician gets hired, they're just kind of thrown into the deep end. right? And the lead maintenance guy is also doing a lot of work. And there's things you can learn from reading, and there's things you can learn through guided step-by-step guides, but you also just have to do it, right? Doing it and having it be successful is where esteem comes from, it's where confidence comes from. It's how people get better at things. That's not going to change. Like that is humans, right? Like I heard someone say recently, we were all bad at walking at some point, right? And then we've learned to walk, right? So how do you get better at things? You do the thing you're not good at. And as we get older, we tend to lose that patience to do something that we're bad at and allow it to improve. Now, I do think AI massively unlocks the ability for someone to go from generalist to expert, right? So I don't think it's necessarily that it's either or. I think it's a progression based on what people are learning. And I'll use myself as an example there. In the end of 2023, I was an AI enthusiast. Today, I would consider myself, at least in the pragmatic use of it and an understanding of how LLMs and modern models work. I'm going off of other people's feedback to me. I'm an expert. Now, was that took me 2.5 years, right? Or a year, 18 months, 2 years of hard work, focus, learning, being frustrated. Like right before we started, I mentioned to you like with some of the StreamYard stuff and also in my journey with AI is the great benefit I have is I figured out really early the problem was me, right? And I just needed to get better. So AI to me today is an incredible teacher. And if you put it in the hands of the right people and being able to use it in a clean way that's not obstructive to their workflows, then you can level your team up. And it almost becomes like I mentioned software as a tool. The future of software is more than a tool. It's a coach, it's an accountability partner, it's an advisor, it's right, it's everything. And I think those tools could be built today, but most people aren't building them. They're building things to replace people instead of augment people. And I think the goal should be how do we augment people, make them better. As fast as this is moving, we're not going to have Optimus robots or whatever robot company you fancy working at our properties doing maintenance in the next 5 years. Maybe we will. I might be wrong about that, but we're not. We're gonna have humans, and humans need to feel like they're good at something to want to continue to do it.
I love this because now we get to have you back. We may have to have a 2-on-2 debate about robots in the next 3 to 5 years and how prolific they will be because Whitney Kidd is working hard on this. And there's several people in Atlanta, I know, and other cities who are working hard on this. So it'd be a
Now,
great debate for another episode for
now
sure.
you give me a 6 to 10 year horizon, absolutely,
Yeah.
right? But you're going to see adoption in factory environments first, to the extent that self-driving cars or robots. You'll see that this summer, even more so when because Tesla's going to have their robotaxi service starting in Austin here in a couple months. It's going to like the first robots are still probably what a year plus from being deployed. They're not going to be at manufacturing scale yet. They're not going to be cheap enough. No one's going to buy $100,000 robot for a property. Now, when they're 20,000 and they've been proven to be safe, because again, we're going into people's homes, right? This isn't like assembling a car or working in a factory or something like that, where it's a more controlled environment. I was worried just over a year ago that like agents were going to be everywhere in the next 3 months because I was playing with agents, right? Like I was doing things with AI and I was like, man, if I'm doing this, then like everyone's going to be doing it soon because I'm an idiot. And I just am like interested in this stuff. Well, here we are 15 months later and there's no agents anywhere, right? Like they exist, but not in the way that they're like fully doing jobs and like reimagining software and all this stuff at scale, right? It's happening in pockets. And when you get really close to something and you're in, like I've learned this with AI, I'm around a lot of people working AI all the time. So we're talking about all the latest and greatest and the tip of the spear things. But the reality is then, as Adrian kind of mentioned with his conversations with people about ChatGPT, you go talk to people in the real world, right? And in the business world and enterprise customers, and they're not there yet. And I think that's going to be that same thing with robots. 10-year horizon, absolutely. because it is going to move very quick when it starts. But next 4.5 years, you might see some really like innovative people doing it, but you're not going to see it at scale yet. That's just my gut based on how things have gone the last year and a half, and there's still so much to figure out there. It's crazy how fast it's moving. I don't think by 2030 we'll be there. 2030 we'll have AI agents doing a lot. We'll have the digital world will be, I think, will be have been completely transformed. The workplace will be transformed, but it's going to be those people who know how to use AI who are benefiting most from it. And then I would say the next 5 years will be the year of the robot at scale.
This has been a blast and a lot of fun. So I know we're gonna have to do a round two coming up one of these days soon, and maybe get you out to Atlanta for a in the studio podcast.
Yeah, no, I'd love that. I wanted to make it out this time, but couldn't. And had a handful of things going on. So, but yeah, definitely love to come back. I mean, both you guys know I love y'all and have a ton of respect and appreciation for you. And anything I can do to help or share, I'm always happy to do it. And frankly, conversations like these are how you get smarter, right? Like I like the conversations with people who disagree with me most because that's where I learn the most, or at least it makes me practice and like refine my perspective, as opposed to just assuming I know everything and locking myself in a bubble. We've seen how that kind of works over the past few years in some other venues other than business, and it doesn't usually turn out that well. So I think the more, as an industry, we can talk to people with different ideas or who we disagree with, or who are trying to think out of the box, I think everyone's better served for it.
Stephen, our door is always open. Like Chris said, we'd love to, do a sit down with you. This was a fascinating conversation, like truly fascinating. I could have gone for like 3-4 hours easily, kept going. But the beautiful thing is that, we have so much to talk about for like 3-4 other episodes, at least just to get warmed up. Much appreciate you being with us today. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Another amazing conversation, another amazing multifamily hangout. Also want to thank our sponsors for making it possible, our friends from Kairos and Coastal Painting Contractors. You all take care, and we'll see you next time. Have a great afternoon.